Hello, students, and welcome. Today, we're going to talk about something incredibly important, something that every single living cell has. We're going to explore the plasma membrane. You can think of it as the cell's own personal gatekeeper, a flexible, living barrier that decides what comes in and what goes out. It's what separates the living world inside the cell from the non-living world outside. So, let's get right into it. Here's what we'll be covering today. We'll start by understanding why a cell even needs a boundary. Then we'll look at how things move across this boundary, first through a simple process called diffusion, and then a special case for water, which is osmosis. We'll see how this movement of water can actually change a cell's shape. After that, we'll learn how cells can actively pull things in from the outside. And finally, we'll summarize why this membrane is so absolutely vital for.
So, let's begin with a very fundamental idea. To be considered alive, a cell has to have an inside that is different from the outside. It needs to keep a stable, controlled environment within itself. And to do that, well, it needs a boundary, a border, that separates its internal world from everything else out there.
Now this brings up a really important question, doesn't it? If a cell is enclosed by a boundary, how does it get the things it needs to survive, like oxygen or food? And how does it get rid of waste products like carbon dioxide? You see, it has to control this movement very carefully. The answer to this puzzle lies in the special nature of that boundary.
And that special boundary is called the plasma membrane. Now, it's very important to understand that this is not like a stiff, dead wall. No, the plasma membrane is a flexible, living part of the cell. It's made up of molecules like lipids and proteins, and it's constantly active. Think of it more like the cell's skin. It's dynamic and it's alive. The most important feature of the plasma membrane, its superpower if you will, is that it is selectively permeable. It's a big term, but the idea is simple. It means the membrane is selective. It's like a very strict security guard at a gate. It allows some substances to pass through, but it prevents other substances from entering or leaving. This careful selection is absolutely key to the cell's survival.
Okay, so how do things actually move across this selective membrane? Let's start with the simplest way, a process known as diffusion. And the best thing about it for the cell is that it happens all by itself. It requires absolutely no energy from the cell.
To understand diffusion, think about this. You've all experienced it. If someone sprays some perfume in one corner of a room, what happens? After a little while, you can smell it from all the way across the room. The smell has spread out. That, right there, is diffusion in action.
Now, let's look at the scientific definition from your textbook. Diffusion is the spontaneous or natural movement of a substance from an area where there is a lot of it, a high concentration, to an area where there is less of it, or a low concentration. The particles just naturally spread out until they are evenly distributed.
And this simple process is how a cell breathes. A cell constantly uses up oxygen, so the concentration of oxygen inside the cell becomes low. Outside the cell, there's more oxygen, so oxygen simply diffuses from the outside in. At the same time, the cell produces carbon dioxide as a waste product, so its concentration becomes high inside the cell. And what happens? It simply diffuses out. It's a beautiful, efficient process that costs the cell no energy.
Now, water is so incredibly important for all life that the diffusion of water across the cell membrane gets its own special name. It is still a type of diffusion, but we call this special case osmosis.
So what is osmosis? It's simply the movement of water molecules. But the key things to remember are that it happens across a selectively permeable membrane, just like the plasma membrane. And, just like diffusion, the water moves from an area of high water concentration to an area of low water concentration. So in short, osmosis is the diffusion of water.
Now, the effect of osmosis on a cell can be quite dramatic. What happens to a cell really depends on the amount of water in the solution that surrounds it. Let's look at 3 different scenarios that can happen.
First, let's place a cell in what we call a hypotonic solution. The word hypo means less solute. If there's less solute, it means there is more water. So the solution outside has a higher concentration of water compared to the inside of the cell. Because of osmosis, the water will move from outside into the cell. And what's the result? The cell will gain water and swell up. Next, we have an isotonic solution. Iso means the same. This one is quite straightforward. Here, the concentration of water outside the cell is exactly the same as the concentration inside. Now, this doesn't mean water stops moving. It moves in and out at the same rate. So there is no net movement of water. And because of that, the cell stays the same size. And our final case is the hypertonic solution.
Hyper means more solute. If there's more solute in the solution, it means there is a lower concentration of water compared to the cell. So this time, osmosis will cause water to move from inside the cell out into the solution. The result? The cell loses water and shrinks.
You can actually see this happening with a simple experiment at home. If you take a dry raisin and place it in a bowl of plain water, just leave it for a few hours. What will you see? It plumps up and swells. That's because the plain water is a hypotonic solution for the raisin cells, so water moved into the cells by osmosis. Your NCERT PLOOK also mentions doing this with an egg after dissolving its shell in acid. It's a perfect real-world example.
So far, we've talked about diffusion and osmosis. These are called passive processes because the cell doesn't need to use any of its own energy. But sometimes, a cell needs to bring in much larger things, like a food particle. For this, it needs a totally different process, one that does require energy.
And this process is called endocytosis. Endo means into. This is where that flexibility of the plasma membrane really shines. The membrane can literally change its shape to wrap around and engulf material from the outside. But remember, unlike diffusion, this is an active process. The cell has to spend energy to make it happen.
The classic example that we study for this is the single-celled amoeba. When an amoeba finds a particle of food, its plasma membrane is so flexible that it extends these arm-like projections around the food. These projections then join together, trapping the food particle and pulling it inside the cell in a little bubble called a food vacuole. That is endocytosis in action. Okay, so that was a lot of information. Let's just pause for a moment and summarize the most important points we have learned about this vital membrane. So, let's quickly revise our key takeaways. First, the plasma membrane is selectively permeable. It's the cell's gatekeeper. Second, diffusion is the passive, energy-free movement of substances like oxygen and carbon dioxide. Third, osmosis is the special name we give to the diffusion of water, and it affects the cell shape. And finally, endocytosis is the active, energy-using process where the cell engulfs large materials.
This statement really captures the main idea perfectly. The cell membrane isn't just a bag holding things in. It is an active, working part of the cell. Its main job is to regulate or control the movement of materials, making sure the inside of the cell stays organized and alive.
And that leaves us with one final thought to ponder. Every single living thing on Earth, from the smallest bacterium to the largest whale, depends on this simple principle. So just think about it. How amazing is it that this one tiny membrane, just by controlling what goes in and out, creates the conditions necessary for all of life as we know it? It's a truly remarkable thing. Thank you for your attention.